onto the internet right away.
Okay.
And then we'll kind of talk about how it developed here, and then organically, then you can ask.
Sounds good.
And draw George in.
Okay.
Because this shows. Okay.
So you tell me when we start.
You're going to have to kind of count me back because I can't see the monitor. It's a really cool set. The monitor's behind us.
Is Josh, are you here?
Josh is around. Is Josh around?
Yes, he's here.
Hey, Josh, could you give me a glass of water? A cup of water from over...
Okay. Well, you ready to start,
Thanks.
Paula, or should we wait?
Oh, here, let's use the bottom one of this.
Yeah.
You need another chair?
Just a glass of water.
A cup of water.
Glass of water?
Yeah. Can someone just sort of go 5, 4, 3 so I know when to... Okay, when I see the light, I'll start. Okay?
Okay, you ready?
Yes. Tape is rolling.
Yeah.
Okay, here we go.
Oh, Josh is bringing some water. I'm sorry, we're going to have to backtrack it. I didn't know that a minute went by so quick. Did a minute go by so quick?
We're up to 2 minutes now. You want to rewind the tape?
Nah, that's okay. Just roll. I'm going to edit this anyway. Okay.
Okay, ready?
Hi, this is Paula Glory, and this show is called Farther Down the Rabbit Hole because we like to go into topics more deeply. I'm so honored to have with me today people who are going to help us go into the topic of public access television more deeply. My guest is Dan Coughlin, who's the Executive Director of Manhattan Neighborhood Network. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you, Paula.
And also Ugly George, who is absolutely famous and notorious for his work, The Ugly George Show, that really got attention to access television in the 1980s. So welcome, both of you.
Thanks, Paula.
So Dan, how long have you been Executive Director here at Manhattan Neighborhood Network?
Started here at MNN in January of 2006. Time flies, but like many Manhattan residents, I have had been to MNN before on different programs and obviously knew a little bit about MNN. I think a lot of folks living in Manhattan tend to have some experience with MNN over the years, brushing alongside it in one form or another. So I had been down to MNN before. I'd known people here, but I only started working here in January of 2006, so about 2.5 years.
And prior to that, what was your education in that got you into this field? Because I know between you getting out of college and winding up at MNN, you've also done a lot of things.
Yeah, I started off actually working by accident as a reporter, and worked for many years in print journalism, in particular for a news agency called Interpress Service, which was known as Interpress Service Third World News Agency, which covered the global South, Latin America, the Caribbean, Africa, Asia, from the perspective of people living in the global South.
So you traveled there?
I did a lot of work at the UN here in New York and in the Caribbean with various issues in the Caribbean.
How did you land a job like that?
Again, you know, just kind of by accident.
I mean, where'd you go to college?
I went to college at Tufts University in Boston.
And you studied what?
History.
History?
Yeah.
And then you wound up with such a glamorous, you know, occupation.
Yes, well, that's it may appear glamorous on the outside, but a lot of hard work, and as an editor and a wordsmith, and so it was a great experience. And Interpress Service does a remarkable job of trying to bring stories that ordinarily you wouldn't get in your regular newspaper. And I worked there for about 5 years. And then from there, I went on to join Pacifica Radio,
right?
And in their national programming unit, and started working there with Democracy Now! When it was just had been launched. And when did it get launched? In '96. It was so long ago now.
In
1996.
And were you living in Berkeley then?
No, I was living here in New York and
while
in
you
Washington.
were doing the Pacifica work?
Yeah.
Why did I think it was a Berkeley thing?
Well, it eventually, as I stayed at Pacifica for 9 years, first as a producer with Democracy Now!, and then as a national news director, and then eventually as executive director of Pacifica Radio, I moved out to Berkeley. A number of years ago, and so I was in fact out in Berkeley. So you're not crazy.
I see. Okay, right. Even though I'm from Berkeley.
And of course, it comes. You know, it started in the Bay Area back in the 40s. Pacifica did. So it has.
So then you were a Manhattan person, and then for that time you were on the West Coast, and then you came back from the West Coast.
Right. Never left my Manhattan roots and New York roots, and
then picked up with MNN.
Yes.
Or were you at WBAI?
No, I came back from Berkeley and picked up with MNN shortly thereafter. Had a little family. Had 2 little girls. My wife gave birth to 2 little girls. So I came back from California and moved back to New York, and we started a family. And shortly thereafter, I came to MNN. So
where does your wife like it better, by the way? East Coast or West Coast?
Well, she's originally from the West Coast. And
so she has affinities with
She has affinities on both coasts, but she loves New York.
And she likes being with you,
yes.
and then the life you're leading. Well, what I want to kind of highlight on this show, because I know the time's going to go really quickly, is when you spoke at Harold's ACAP meetings about the future of Manhattan Neighborhood Network and the refranchising, it really, a penny really dropped with me that it may not have with others, and that was that you didn't want to be given the first offer to just be on an internet channel. And so what I wanted to do then is to draw George into this with his experience of how cable got built up in the first place. So could you maybe recap your latest encounter with this internet thing? Because I have strong feelings about that.
I think you know, public access and what's called as public educational and government television, PEG channels, throughout the country are well established as local voices as part of cable operations. And increasingly, a lot of cable operators are trying to get rid of PEG. And they're trying to say, some of them are trying to say, well, you can go to the internet, you don't need to be on the local cable system. And people can watch you on the internet. And that's a way of trying to get rid of responsibilities and obligations to local communities that cable operators serve. So while of course I think it's very important that public access and public access producers and programmers have a voice on the internet, and we need to ensure that there's a public interest component in the internet, which increasingly does not exist. But
what increasingly does not exist?
A public interest within the internet or broadband
You are
services.
so right. This whole show's worth it just for that statement.
Right. And it's a serious situation where new media is being created, but there's never a public interest component of that new media. Unlike some old media, at least with cable, there is some public interest obligation. There is a social responsibility on the part of large media companies, and granted, and George could probably get into this a little bit more, it had to be fought for and struggled for. But within the cable operators today, there is a social responsibility and a public interest piece built in. But increasingly in new media, in broadband and digital media, often the public interest component is nowhere to be found.
Right, right. And particularly the Telecommunications Act of 1996 seemed to have taken that away.
Yes. And so you see satellite systems coming into play using public property. It's the same concept. Cable access needs to rent the public land to provide their services. And in return for that rent on the public land, they are obligated to provide some public interest level of programming. But on the other hand, you don't see that in like satellite television, even though it's still public airwaves that are being used.
So satellite is not going under the ground like cable was, but you're saying that the airwaves, it's part of the public's airwaves.
Yes,
wow, that's an
these
interesting
companies
concept.
are given licenses and granted licenses to operate, and obviously, you know, in such high technology areas such as wireless phones and other areas, these are licenses that are granted by the federal government to private companies. And it is akin to like an oil company getting a grant from public land to use the public land to produce oil, but yet they don't have to pay royalties on that.
Right,
well,
right.
You know, that's unfair.
It seems, though, until the medium is used and the content is there that people want, they're not going to really notice how important it is. And if they don't know if it's important, then, you know, laws can be passed and valuable rights can be given up that you didn't even know you had.
Yeah, no, it's very important. One prime example of this is children's programming. There was requirements for years, and even there still is on the books, that program producers, broadcasters, and others are to produce a certain amount of children's programming. And now increasingly we see that requirement being either not enforced or not being observed. And there's all kinds of public interest requirements that are not being implemented now in all kinds of media, and yet because it's not being implemented, just like you say, people forget it's not there, it doesn't become important, and pretty soon, you know, if you don't use it, you lose it.
Right, right. What do you think is the most important challenge that MNN is facing right now?
Well, it's a short-term challenge, and it's to work with the City of New York to ensure that the new deals, the new contracts given to the cable and phone giants to access the city streets and the public rights-of-way, that they contain, these new deals which are being negotiated now, adequate protections for the people of New York around customer service issues, around public educational and government access channels, and other issues. So it's very important that those public interest obligations are indeed strengthened and observed in the next 10 years.
What about something like DirecTV or even Sirius Satellite? They don't have any public access.
No, and again, they're done at a national level, but they ought to have a public interest obligation, and somehow, you know, they've wiggled their way out of that.
When you say hard fought or hard won, do you think that's something that attentive people should be paying attention to?
Yes, and I think there are a lot of folks in Washington who are trying to, public interest groups who are trying to fight for that. But it becomes very arcane often because people don't, it's not as easy to understand as, say, you know, an oil well in Central Park or something. You know?
Right. But it's more valuable even than an oil well in Central Park.
Indeed, but it's the public airwaves, so you can't touch it. It's hard to necessarily see all the time, and so it becomes a little more obtuse and arcane and hard for all of us to understand what's going on. You know, and that confusion is used against often the public interest.
Now, to help the public be more interested, what do you think we producers can do? And particularly like with George, he's got a real high batting average with viewership.
Well, I think one of the things that folks can do is get involved with groups that are trying to reform the media and ensure that the public interest component is met. There's one group here in New York, Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, and you can go to their website at fair.org. There's another group called Free Press, based out of Massachusetts and out of Washington, D.C. They do a lot of great work. There's unions, some unions who are doing great work around media reform. If folks are a member of CWA or Journalists Union or the Guild, the Newspaper Guild, etc. So there's different ways that folks can get involved in ensuring that the public interest component is met. But one of the first websites I'd go to is fair.org or freepress.org. They have a lot of information. Consumers Union is very active in media reform issues. Common Cause is very active in media reform issues. So there's a lot of groups, and you can find out how to get started right up on the web.
And I remember watching a show with Sidney Dean, and he was even mentioning, because we have George with us, the importance of freedom of speech. And he said, let the viewers decide. And he said, let them have, and he even mentions the soft porn, is how he put it. How do you view George's work today?
Well, I wasn't fortunate enough to be around at the early days of cable television in New York City, and maybe George might be able to give us a sense of the context of when did cable start in New York, in the city, and how did it evolve over the years?
And I'm glad you asked me that. The reason that we even have PEG today in public access is because I primarily fought the good fight in the summer of 1981. Briefly, what happened was cable came in thanks to Mayor John Lindsay, and he wrote a clause into it that no one else had ever written in any other franchise in any place else in the United States, that the cable company should not interfere in the conduct or the content of public access. No one else did that in any of the other 5,000 franchises. Only Mayor John Lindsay did it here in New York. Actually, it didn't mean much because when cable came in the mid-'70s, it was not popular. You may be not aware of what its enemies called cable, and they had many enemies. They refer to it as pay TV, meaning we're free, so why should you pay to watch TV?
I remember that.
And that was a bad word
young,
they
Dan?
came up with, pay TV.
Pay
and
TV.
They would get that into the press as often as possible. Okay, so somehow cable was bad because it was pay TV. So cable came along, there were sex shows on, they weren't cable began to get a little momentum. And then, to be a little self-serving, I debuted in the mid-'70s. Suddenly cable took off. Suddenly everybody decided they had to get wired for cable. And it began to grow quickly and quickly and quickly, largely because of me. But then its enemies went to work again. And they said, we've got to get rid of public access. And the way we're going to get rid of public access is not to mount a frontal attack against freedom of speech or public access, because that would be too obvious. So you know what we're going to do? We're going to say we're protecting the people, and we're essentially protecting the children. So the opening wedge was, since we have to protect the public, and especially children, let's have laws enacted to allow the cable system and the government to oversee the content of public access cable, what you call PEG now. And therefore, we have to, according to this theory, we in big government have to oversee PEG.
And was this a national law, federal law, or the local?
New York. It was New York, okay? So its enemies got to work, and they went up to a corrupt assemblyman who's now dead, named Assemblyman Melvin Zimmer of Syracuse, and he wrote a very corrupt bill, and he got it through the Assembly Codes Committee in the summer of 1981, allowing the cable systems and government to regulate the content of public access with an eye toward pornography. See, so that was the opening wedge. They were not going to regulate Paula Gloria or Dan Coughlin, but they were going to regulate pornography. We all know that's the first step. Secondly, they were going to regulate this and that and the other thing, all in the guise of protecting the public. The Speaker of the New York State Assembly quietly had me contacted. His name was Stanley Fink at the time. I went up to Albany, supplied some very important ammunition to members of the State Assembly, and the bill was killed. And then in a memorable, very memorable editorial, the New York Times came out, the first time they had supported public access, and they said what Sidney Dean was saying, let subscribers censor cable smut. And they said, we at the New York Times do not approve of Ugly George. They basically called me a male chauvinist pig who took advantage of women. They said, however, like Voltaire, we'll defend to the death his right to do that. And even though we find him distasteful, and we're holding our liberal noses, it's the subscribers that should decide, because they're paying for it. So this bill should be killed. So we did an ed run around the very corrupt Melvin Zimmer of Syracuse and his paper up there, whom I called and said, you don't understand, he's our assemblyman. How could we give a differing point of view? He's our assemblyman. This is the way small-time editors think. We have our assemblyman, our congressman. We can't allow both sides of the issue because he's our assemblyman, okay? We killed the bill. And the Times editorial became kind of a landmark.
Now, so when cable came in the mid-'70s in Manhattan,
right.
It started, what, around 74, 75? 74.
Sterling Manhattan cable
And that was what, a local independent company, or was it a national company?
Well, there was a little sort of end run done around. As I understand the story, Sterling Manhattan was Chuck Dolan. But Chuck Dolan was not satisfied because the growth of cable was agonizingly slow in Manhattan in 74, 75, and early 76. And he was actually, I believe, losing money. But he certainly wasn't making money. So he did a swap, as I understand it, with the company that later became Time Warner. And he said, give me your franchises on Long Island because I see greater potential on Long Island. He called his company Cablevision, as he still does. Time Warner was not happy with their franchises on Long Island. So as I understand the story, just before he came to cable, they swapped. So Time Warner took over Manhattan. It was an empty victory. It meant absolutely nothing. Because in the days when I first came to cable, it was said home box office was losing $2 million a month. Losing $2 million a month, okay? Sylvester Stallone and Rocky turned that around. The first time they ran Rocky, suddenly everybody decided they had to subscribe to cable. Then Ugly George came along, and I did something that no one had ever done before. I was on 2 local TV channels an hour before my show premiered. Suddenly, everyone decided they had to call the cable company, this is 10 and 11 o'clock at night, and say, how can I watch Channel J? I don't want to watch it, but my neighbor has heard about it. And my neighbor wants to watch this filthy, disgusting, Ugly George show. People didn't understand about cable. They called from the Bronx, Brooklyn, and Queens. And many people who didn't have cable said, where's Channel J? I only have 2 to 13. There's no J here, which meant least public access at the time. Today you call it Channel 35. So everybody wanted to be offended, but didn't admit it.
Excuse me, you were on a leased channel?
Yeah, at that time they had leased public access, which meant, just like public access, you could say and do anything you wanted to, except you had to pay for it because you would lease the time.
So
now,
there was no free public access?
Yes, there was free access, but the difference between them and J was you could sell commercials on J because it began to become very expensive to do public access shows. So they created a Channel J, which simply meant leased public access. You paid a fixed amount for the time, you paid for 13 weeks up front, but whatever you got for the commercials was your business. I made that so successful that they decided to take it out of the franchise in 1990. And when they granted the new franchise, which I think went into effect in 1991, they dropped Channel J. What's the difference between Channel 35 and Channel J? Channel 35 is commercial access, not leased public access. It means you have no right to be on Channel 35. You simply negotiate with the cable franchise holder, who as we know is Time Warner, and whatever they decide to charge you, it's their business. If they don't like your show or want it censored, it's their business. It's not public access. But from roughly 1976 to roughly 1990, we had Channel J leased public access, where they had to accept access shows.
What, on a first-come, first-served basis?
Yeah,
on a rotational?
Yeah. Okay. Of course, what they did behind the scenes when I became very popular, they increased my rates 500%. See, everybody else was being charged a certain amount. They increased me 5 times.
Oh, I see. Because
and then they said, see, you didn't pay your bill. Okay? And of course, the city franchise let them get away with it. At the time, it was a corrupt city commissioner named Morris Tarsus, who was director of franchises for the city of New York. It'd be like you coming home and paying $20 a month for your phone bill, and the next day you walk in and suddenly your phone bill is $100. They increased it 5 times.
The way I view this, because I'm a West Coast person, so I never saw the show when it was on, but it seemed as though it gave the common guy courage and hope that he too could score with women, because he didn't make any pretenses about being a special person that could pick up chicks, or, you know, he's a producer that's going to give them, you know, starring roles. And I think that story was so human, and it was so compelling to viewers that it became threatening to established ways to present people with entertainment that then has tagged on with it, you know, a lot of advertising. So my concern right now is I see many valuable sites on YouTube that are taken down. And at the same time, I have heard, I haven't explored it that much, there are sites of horrible pedophiles, and they don't take those down. So how do you balance this whole issue of censorship? I think to say no censorship at all is, I mean, I would tend to be towards no censorship at all, because I think there is a self-regulating mechanism. Maybe Harold Channer would call it autodidactic, self-teaching. But we definitely do have forces working behind the scenes that want to get us to buy a product, to go to war, to you know, encourage more violence, so become better soldiers. So given that there is this influence going on, how does one deal with it, with the internet and with cable? And maybe you could answer by saying, why did you not want to be on the internet when everything seems to be going towards the internet and cable seems to be passé?
Well, sounds like a two-part question. I think first of all, just in terms of the internet, I think it's important that public access be on the internet, but not just on the internet. It's important that public access still have channels on local cable systems and not be pushed aside to only one media at all, the internet. So I think public access needs to be active on the media. Public interest programming needs to be, public access needs to be on the internet. Public interest programming needs to be on the internet. But we also need to be in other different media, like local cable systems. In terms of what, you know, in terms of the speech that's permitted, or you know, what form do you use to determine what's permitted or not? I think the First Amendment is a pretty good guideline. That's what we use here at MNN. I've been here 2 years, and you know, it seems to have served MNN very well and producers very well over the last 2 years, and certainly over the last 15 years. It seems like a very good standard to use for the broad community of both of producers and indeed of viewers.
I would tend to agree, because of my experience on the internet, you know, that shows are not taken down because of copyright infringement. I think the general rule of thumb here is that at least 50% of your show, 51%, has to be original material, and so that would be a rough rule of thumb of that you would be using fair use to comment on important social icons that are, you know, in society's awareness.
And also, I think it's important to keep in mind that our programming is non-commercial. So it is not as if producers at MNN are abusing the system or gaming or you know, making huge amounts of money off the airing of a song or something that has a copy, that maybe may make a copyright infringement, but it's not as if it's for personal gain or.
Well, you see,
or profitability.
You know, oftentimes an art form emerges out of an angst in a culture, and right now there's an enormous art form emerging with the 9/11, the wake of 9/11, and the TV fakery that was done, and it's called mashups, where one artist will take some images from another artist, and they'll combine it with theirs, or they'll even take the entire image and put it on their site, like in the case of YouTube. And the benefit of this is when you watch it on that particular site, it is administered by somebody whose judgment you trust or you feel you can have a rapport with, so that you have these blogs and comments, and people comment back and forth and back and forth. So I would say I'm approaching 1 million hits on my site, and yet I've seen on some of these savvy sites some of my material taken over to someone else's site, and it has 3 times the hits, which means that if you're sincere about getting your message out, you're not feeling ripped off that somebody took your material away, but you're rather exalted, you feel really happy. And because of that development of the material, it comes back to you, and you start learning. You have like a research and development, you know, team working for you, and it makes your work better. And it's that kind of self-teaching mechanisms. So it's happening so fast on the internet, and it never could happen on MNN because I never had the chance to have these blogs day and night. I had call-ins on MNN, but that was only live in the moment. So as this new technology emerges and we pay attention to it, I think we can take some of what you've learned or what you represent now with the First Amendment, and then what the technology will afford us. I know you.
Now, here's an important comment for both Dan and Paula. Just the fact that there are interesting things on MNN, just the fact that there are interesting things that blonde Paula Gloria does, and MNN in general, is a threat to somebody. Some people in corporate boardrooms get jealous about MNN, just simply because it exists, just simply because it's an alternative. So I hope you're aware of that.
And you know what else? When you say simply exists, it's almost like an embarrassment to be swept under the carpet at a time when you could sort of, I hate to use the word deceive, but it is kind of deceptive when people are doing kind of plotting to see, and like you say, an oil well in the middle of Central Park could not possibly be more valuable than the bandwidth or the cable access that we're talking about. And yet, until it's developed, people don't see that. So it's like we have to sort of see over the horizon, kind of gaining from the experience of George here, who saw that cable was kind of dead in the water. And it was, I think, you know, when he really took off was when a mainline station said, "Never watch this horrible, smutty show." And then that night it just exploded. Everybody wanted to see what they weren't supposed to see. And then it took off. So if we can kind of gain from our collective experience, maybe we can steer a better course for the future, both for cable and for the internet, because I keep holding up to all my viewers, and I have viewers all over the world now on the internet, that we do have this example here in Manhattan, and we need to follow it very carefully. And I'm just trying to sort of widen your awareness of how important this MNN experience is to the internet, and can we take back, you know, the important features.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, this is why we care about free speech, why we care about the First Amendment, because words do have meaning, because it is critical to have that diversity of voices, diversity of opinions. It's essential to the society that we live in. It's essential to democracy. And so it's very, very important that we continue to defend the First Amendment.
Let me make an important observation. In 1981, the French were the first to call me from overseas and say, every French person that visits New York talks about your show because it's different. It's not just a porn show. It's about how you pick up women. And when they came here, they were amazed, totally amazed. I mean, over and over again, the French producer sat there, Manhattan Cable, and he said 36 channels. He just couldn't conceive of a television system that had 36 channels. Because in 1981, in most of the world, you had 2 channels. Almost all, both of them were controlled in every country by the government, one way or another. RAI, for example, is the Italian government. French TV, in a sense, was the French government. Of course, usually through frontmen. But it never did anything that the government didn't approve of. And how many television channels were there in almost every country in 1981? 2. And so the French came here, they just couldn't believe. They kept turning through the dials in my studio. 36 channels? They couldn't conceive of anything like that.
But you know what's important now that we have to watch is you might have 700 channels today, but they're all owned by 2 companies.
I'm glad you pointed that out.
And so what's happening is it appears you have the appearance of more and more opinions, but in reality you don't. It's like walking down the shelves of your supermarket and choosing your cereal, and if you look at it looks like everything is different, but really it's all high fructose corn syrup. Right. And behind the scenes, and that's exactly what's happening now. And we have to, a critical part of the First Amendment is not just the issue of ensuring, of having a diversity of viewpoints, but in order for that to happen, you have to have a diversity of ownership. a diversity of platforms. And slowly it's being eviscerated until there's 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 very large multinational corporations that dominate global media and thus are able to limit expression and limit debate and limit opinion.
Dan, who are you threatening today with this institution right here? What corporations are shaking in their boots saying, we've got to do something about this damn MNN and Dan Coughlin?
Well,
Who's afraid of you?
I hope I'm not threatening anybody, George. I hope I'm simply inspiring everybody to relinquish control of their media empires to community media groups around the country.
By creating connections of empathy.
Write that down, students.
Well, who do you think he's threatening?
I dare not say.
Okay, don't say.
I dare not say the name of corporate boardrooms with thick carpeting right now, sitting around mahogany tables saying, how can we get rid of this damn MNN?
Yeah, but we know the players. You know, it's all boiling down to 3 or 4, 5 maybe players. Time Warner, News International, Rupert Murdoch, CBS, Viacom, etc. We know the increasing homogenization of ownership, of centralization of ownership in the mass media is threatening the First Amendment and diversity of viewpoints itself. And I think people in the United States recognize that, increasingly.
And there's one word I can say. Who you're threatening, PBS, Ralph Baruch. Are we allowed to say Ralph Baruch?
I have no idea who he is. But
well, Ralph Baruch is PBS. He is the Corporation for Public Broadcast, a private corporation supported by the American people through their tax money.
You seem cynical, George.
Cynical? Good
Why?
heavens. These people don't want competition, as Dan points out in his clever way, okay? As he points out, this is a very good comment. 700 channels, but all controlled by 2 boardrooms. That's a very trenchant analysis, okay?
But
And I should just say, just speaking of PBS, as a kind of what's developing with PBS is a state media, a federal government-controlled media. We've seen what happens to PBS over the last decade, certainly. And you mentioned the BBC and RAI and Deutsche Welle and RFI, Radio France International, and the state media. One of the things that I think historically has happened in the United States is that media developed very much locally. For many years, localism and regionalism in media characterized the American media landscape. And public access is part of that, because what we...
when you say media, you mean radio, newspaper,
well, you
TV
you never had a BBC in the United States, that one media company that controlled the television and all the radio.
And do you know why? Do you know who the BBC really is? The name is Windsor. In other words, the royal family of England is the BBC. When I was there, I was amazed at the little trucks going up and down the streets with very careful little receivers and transmitters, and very carefully able to measure the faint emissions of every television set. You know, a tube television especially puts out a faint emission, and they would check it on their computer on that street. This is not a joke. I was in Maida
What were
Vale
they checking
in London.
for?
They were checking to see who had a television set on every street. And they could do that from this little van that went up and down the street. Then they would check it against their master list of something that Dan doesn't mention, the license. It cost you £100 a year to own a television set in England.
Oh, so
for each television.
They were like looking for illegal hookups.
Just an illegal television. It's illegal to own a television in many countries around the world, not only communist Russia, but also Great Britain. And if they found that your television was not licensed, they have no Fourth Amendment there. They would break down your door and haul you off to jail, and you would pay an enormous fine. Wow. As a warning to everyone else, when you buy a television or a radio, you must license it with the BBC annually. That's £100 per year per set.
So
they even license VCRs.
So it seems as though there's always been this issue of control in the media, but you're saying media is a local feature here in this country?
Well, there's a part of the tradition in the United States around the media in the United States that localism and regional media have been very important historically in the United States. Compare it to you know, a Deutsche Welle or a RAI, where you have the giant state media enterprise dominating media.
Right.
Now, I'm not saying, you know, that you couldn't have a national media organization, but local, being able to have local voices, regional voices represented in the media that we have available to us is very important. And indeed, some would say a life and death issue. There's the famous case, Minot, North Dakota, January a few years ago, a chlorine train derailed. And when the local police went to the radio stations in town to put out the word to the residents to stay indoors or to get protection from the chlorine leak that was happening, they knocked on the doors of the radio stations, but they were owned by Clear Channel that was programming the stations from a central location in San Diego. So the local police and local emergency workers could not alert the community to the crisis.
Right.
So when you talk about localism in media, it's not just about diversity of views. It can be a life and death issue in many communities, literally.
You brought that up at the ACAP meeting, and I think whatever feature has to be built in to make sure you get the signal to San Diego to send the warning out in a timely way, it's just as urgent, because here is a local issue for us is 9/11. That's in our neighborhood. The World Trade Center was in our neighborhood, and yet the implications now are worldwide. A whole war was started that we're still embroiled in. Now, one of my viewers, and I know you have to check things out on the internet, one of my commenters said that at MNN they locked things down, or the people in the control room were changed. Now, he may just be trying to alarm me that MNN is not the free place I thought it was compared to the internet taking things down. So if I was to check this out, how would I find out?
That what?
That during the day of 9/11, like, do you know what television fakery is of 9/11? TV fakery?
No.
The TV fakery movement of 9/11 is probably one of the most bewildering and frightening and horrifying, and yet it's something that produces the most balance and peace, because having studied it for 3 years, it seems to have the most truth. And that was very
What I really like was 700 channels but 2 boardrooms. That's very good.
That's huge.
Did you think that up yourself?
Just right on the spot, George.
What about
What a mind. You must be from Pacifica.
So anyway, the idea is if people are not seeing faithful images on television, something like Ugly George's show, if a young guy sees images on TV that says you have to have this kind of car and you have to, you know, own all of this stuff, and only that way are you going to be successful with women. Once he sees someone like Ugly George's show, he gets another thought. He gets another idea.
Can I just interject for a minute?
Okay.
You're talking about fakery. What Paula means is that they, on computer graphics, made up some of these planes crashing into the World Trade Center. I can tell you flat out that the bosoms on my show were not generated on computer. That was absolutely real, and Dan can testify to that.
Okay, so, but the idea is that people will gravitate towards truth. Like you say, in Minot, North Dakota, they desperately needed accurate information, but it was thwarted. So whatever path you use to make sure that the police has access to San Diego or whatever, however it's working, that, I think, is the path we need to take a look at to bring, to heal a lot of broken hearts now to people, musicians who know how to hear soundtracks, people who work in animation, people who clearly know that something was very amiss, and yet they're now telling me, this is just recently, oh ho ho, Paula Gloria, farther down the rabbit hole, don't think that Manhattan Neighborhood Network has also not been affected, so that can we consider that we too may be a feature of this corporate control? And can we, like you say, not be a threat to anyone, but create connections of empathy to say that at the corporate level, are you really going to be served by violence out of control that may have been unleashed?
I have to interject.
In a small-minded way.
What threat means. Threat means you, because you're interesting, because you're pretty. Threat means Dan Coughlin, because he controls programs here, some of which are very interesting.
Right.
That's a threat. in some corporate boardrooms, that's a threat. What Dan does here scares somebody.
Yeah, but what he also said, I don't want to be a threat to anyone, to me, is the way higher ground on this. And this is where we're going to find solution. Otherwise, you're fighting power with power, and if you're the disempowered, you're never going to succeed. So you've got to find another strategy. That's my interest in nonviolent communication. It's creating connections of empathy so that it's power with, and you have somebody who has more power listening to you and saying, wow, that makes sense. I'm going to have a more meaningful life. Like, in other words, George, look at, if you told somebody to do something and they do it, wouldn't you like to know that they're doing it because they understand why you want them to do it, instead of because you've got a club over their head?
Can I tell you the one word you are leaving out?
What?
Alternative. The very fact that you and Dan do interesting things that people choose to turn to is an alternative. You don't seem to understand that that's a threat, and to some people that's bad.
But
an
you don't.
alternative.
But I don't think Dan thinks it's a threat. I think he thinks they just don't want to pay the extra money.
No, they
What do
think
you
it's
think,
a threat.
Dan?
Pay the extra money on.
I mean, if you're not getting everything you want as executive director of Manhattan Neighborhood Network, why? Why would that be?
Well, in terms of financial commitment to...
Whatever you want. I'm not sure completely what you want, but I mean, because I asked you your background, Pacifica, and things like that. It excited me that you went to parts of the world of people that whose needs aren't being met, that we don't even know their needs aren't being met. So if you put that into the public's awareness, it seems George would say that's going to threaten certain interests. Do you think that's why they might not want it, or do you think they're just stingy? They just don't want to pay any extra money, and they want all the attention all the time on selling Coca-Cola?
Well, I can't. It's hard for me to, discuss the intent and motives of others. I can't, and one can speculate on a variety of different motivations. But certainly, I believe very strongly that the First Amendment must be lived. Freedom must be lived.
Why do you believe in that so much? Let's put it that way.
Well, because if you, like you were saying earlier in the conversation, if you don't use it, you lose it. You've got to, continually. The First Amendment is something that is living, that is organic, that is real, that has to be.
And if we lost it, what would life look like? I mean, why are you so concerned about losing? I'm just trying to figure out ways to...
Well, I think, you could raise a number of dystopias, from 1984 to Aldous Huxley to, I think, a lot of writers and others have talked about dystopias, and one of the features of a dystopia, more recently, I guess, in the last 50, 60, 70 years, has been always, the brutal thought-controlled police and the restrictions on movement and thought and speech and so on. So that's why, it's critically important to have the quote-unquote marketplace of ideas, the full range of opinions. And that's the way a society grows and develops and learns and moves forward. Here at MNN, and I think at other public access centers around the country, we're a platform. All we do here is ensure that people's voices are heard. We don't. I mean, we barely, we're not permitted to engage in any kind of prior restraint of a tape. We don't even look at the technical quality.
But George,
we air that tape,
but George,
no matter,
would you agree
no
with
matter
that?
what.
I'm just trying to tell you, Dan's problem is he's interesting. MNN is interesting. That's a problem to some people. They want you to be dull. And here you are producing some great shows at this fabulous little facility right here, okay? And there are some people in corporate boardrooms that are sitting and saying, how can we stab Coughlin in the back?
We are a David versus Goliath. I like to think of MNN. We're the little, we're the little engine that could. But MNN and what these public access centers do around the country are very important. And and I think whether it's an economic consideration, an ideological issue, a political issue, why media companies are trying to stop the growth and the development of public access centers, which is an objective reality. I don't think there's any debate upon that. We see that in Congress always and everywhere, seeking to marginalize public educational and government channels, making sure they're restricted. That is something that has been going on. That is not in dispute by anybody. I think the industry people would agree with that.
Why do they do that?
Well, some people might say it's economic. George is saying there's political considerations behind it.
And what do you feel?
Well, I think, well, it's hard to know exactly, but certainly the, you know, you can't oftentimes separate one from the other, you know.
Right.
And,
that's true. Harold would say that.
You know, to look at the whole picture at the end of the day, it becomes a question of you know, do we have community support in the public access movement around the country to ensure that we can defend free speech and local voices?
So we're doing that now. We're educating people.
Yes.
Let me break in with another example. You thought 1981 was a long time ago. 1995, there's a place called Nebraska, which is nowhere near Manhattan Neighborhood Network, and there's Senator James Exon, E-X-O-N. And Senator James Exon says, we have a terrible thing. We have public access in New York and this fellow Ugly George. And so I'm going to sponsor a bill in the United States Senate, not to get rid of public access, heaven forbid, but to get rid of pornography and Ugly George. And same thing happened as in 1981. He started to generate some corrupt senators and congressmen in the United States Senate and Congress who said, not that we're against public access, not that we're against diversity, but we must protect our people against pornography. I went to work, and Senator Exon did not run for re-election. Nebraska, they said, Dan Coughlin and MNN here in Manhattan are challenging people in Omaha. They said, you're a threat to Omaha. You.
Yeah, but you're a little BSer here, George, because I thought you said your show got thrown off.
It did, but that's another issue that I don't want to get into, okay? But here was the federal government saying, in effect, we have to protect our citizens from too much public access. We don't want to repeat the MNN mistake.
Well, anyway.
The mistake in New York.
I don't know. I think it's much loved, Dan, and I really thank you for coming here. And I, you know, hope to support whatever you're doing, and that we can keep working together. And I'd like to inform you of what's happening around the world through the internet as they watch this. And because I don't think these are easy answers. I'm against censorship. At the same time, I'm very disturbed by the pedophilia sites.
Yeah, no, you know, clearly when I talk about the First Amendment, you know, we're not. Yeah. You know, there's obviously the First Amendment is not an absolute, and does not include a lot of things, nor should it. But it is for MNN and for other public access centers a guide post that really serves us very well and served MNN very well over the last 15 years. Yeah. But obviously, there's illegal activities that everybody, or I think.
Yeah, but if there was TV fakery done during 9/11, that's hugely illegal, and that's why Harold Channer is working on policies with ACAP. So I don't think it can be totally addressed through policy. I think it takes a certain courage and commitment of the human heart, to move forward and to keep open. And like you say, I think the high ground will be not being threatening to anyone, but to say we want to work with everyone, no matter what the situation is.
Well, Senator Exon would say we've got to stop the MNN mistake, the mistake in New York City of allowing public access, freedom of speech, and diversity because it might be bad for our citizens. So I'm going to introduce a bill to stop public access and PEG channels all over the United States in cable TV here in 1995.
Okay, well, let's...
Because you're a mistake.
Okay, so whether we're a mistake or not, I guess time is only going to tell, and I hope that to keep working together with people like George and Dan, and I thank them so much for coming, and I thank you viewers for paying attention to topics that are so important, and I encourage feedback from you so I can grow wiser about this. Thank you for joining me, and thank you.
Thank you.
A big round of applause.
Thank you.
There we go.
Wow, it's deep, isn't it?
Serious philosophical differences here.
Someday when you get a chance, Dan, I'll show you the 1981 piece, which has now been posted again on the internet. It's not just about me.
Thank you, in the control room.
These French, these people from anywhere except the United States, they just kept going through the box. At that time, it wasn't really even remote. You had to turn it. You had to get up and turn the dial. They couldn't believe 36 channels of anything. All right? Most of the world was like that in 81.
Yeah, incredible, huh? Thank you. Sure, sure.
I have this show, Film Festival News, and we go around to various film festivals and do in-depth interviews with directors and actors and that kind of thing. And often when I apply to these festivals for my press credentials, I have to use your name. I hope you don't mind. It's just that they're asking who assigned. They're used to traditional press, so they're asking who assigned me to a particular thing. So I have to try and explain, and they ask who is the head of the studio and that kind of thing, and I have to put your name into my letter. Do you mind?
Yeah, I do.
Okay, I won't do it anymore.
Yeah. Just because then I'm going to be held responsible. I could be held responsible for those kind of things, so that wouldn't be appropriate.
I see. I see. They were just asking for who are the officials are of the place that I'm working from. So I wanted to ask you if.
Yeah, that wouldn't
I see. I'm
work
glad I
out for
asked
me.
you then.
Thanks for asking.
I won't do
I
it.
think counter that. Who can we say if we're there on assignment or of like an MNN show? We can say, well, somehow we're part of the MNN crew or team.
Well,
Yeah, how
my
do we
understanding